This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Dan Steller. Dan is the state director for the Arizona chapter of the Nature Conservancy, where he leads the organization's efforts across a wide range of cutting-edge initiatives, including forest health, water conservation, resilient cities, healthy grasslands, and more. Arizona is one of the nation's largest and most biodiverse states, which creates a host of extremely unique conservation challenges and opportunities, both in its arid, wide-open landscapes and in its densely populated urban centers. As you'll hear, Dan and his team are implementing conservation solutions that not only benefit people and nature specifically in Arizona, but they're also creating actionable conservation frameworks that can be applied all over the West. Dan was born and raised on the East Coast, and he spent his career in the nonprofit sector, applying his talents to important issues both domestically and abroad. He began his tenure at TNC Arizona back in 2016, when he assumed the role of Deputy State Director. He quickly fell in love with Arizona and TNC's critical work in the state, and in 2020, he assumed the role of State Director. Dan's also a committed endurance athlete, and he's run a mind-blowing number of marathons and half marathons. And on top of all of that, he's a dedicated father, husband, and family man. Dan and I share so many common interests in conservation, endurance sports, and family, so I was super excited to have the opportunity to learn more about the specifics of his work and his fascinating personal and professional journey. We started the conversation with an overview of what makes Arizona such a special place from a conservation perspective. Then we dug into the details of TNC's work in forest health, rivers, aquifers, outdoor recreation, and resilient cities. We talked about some of the lessons he learned from traveling and working internationally, why he chooses to push himself so hard athletically, and how he goes about building such strong relationships with stakeholders, partner organizations, and his TNC team members. Dan's also a voracious reader, so we obviously chatted a lot about books, and he wrapped up the conversation with very wise parting words. I really felt like I'd met a kindred spirit in Dan, and I greatly appreciate everything that he and his team are doing to make Arizona and the American West a better place. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. All right, Dan, thank you so much for taking time. I was saying before we started recording, after reviewing everything that you and your team have going at TNC Arizona, it's just amazing that you have time to do anything, even sleep, because you have so much going on. But I was hoping maybe we could start out just by kind of setting the scene for conservation in Arizona. I feel like you've got such a unique perspective because you've done conservation work literally all over the world, land, water conservation. And so, could you just kind of give us an overview of TNC Arizona and what makes conservation in Arizona unique in the West and in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for I'm a big fan of the podcast. I enjoy listening to it. So thank you for everything you do and for this chance to talk a little bit. So Arizona, as you said, really is a unique place to be doing conservation work. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but I'm not from here originally. And so it's kind of become my adopted home state. And it really is just a fascinating state that is pretty different from, I think, no matter where you're from, at least in the States, Arizona is different a little bit. So a few things I think that are significant from the conservation standpoint, then we can certainly talk about how TNC approaches that here. But it is, and a lot of this I didn't know before I moved here, because I came here just for the Nature Conservancy. Like I said, I'm not from here. And so a lot of things I've learned have been new to me along the way. But it's an exceptionally biologically diverse state, which even that is, I think, surprising to people. It was surprising to me because you tend to just think of, big desert or something, but it is just an unbelievably biologically diverse state. I live in Phoenix, and you can drive 2 hours in kind of any direction and be in a really different environment. I mean, we're Sonoran Desert here, but you can drive 2 hours north and you're in the pine forests and at over 7,000 feet elevation in Flagstaff. Southern Arizona, we have the grasslands. So it's just really a very ecologically and biologically diverse state. And there's all kinds of, statistics about how they rank, stuff like that. And Arizona ranks very high from that standpoint. So that was really interesting to me. And that influences, a lot of our approach here because it is a very fragile and vulnerable ecological environment. So there's that aspect. Another part that's really significant, and of course, from all your extensive work with the Nature Conservancy, that we're very much focused on people and nature, right? And we need to find enduring conservation solutions that benefit both people and nature. We can't just look one or the other. And like much of the West, and maybe even more so than much of the West, Arizona is a tremendously growing state with huge population growth in some of our biggest counties and everything that comes along with that, a lot of positive economic news that comes with that, and a lot of and there certainly can be challenges as well with how we manage that growth. So that's something we think a lot about as well, is the growth aspect. And then just a few other things, as is really well known and widely reported. It's a very hot state, especially Phoenix, which is the hottest major metropolitan area in the country. And there's a lot of issues associated with that, especially as they relate to people and how people navigate living in such a hot place. And like much of the West, the land use and ownership patterns are super interesting and complicated here. Lots and lots of public land, lots of federal land. We have over a quarter of our land is sovereign tribal land. So there's a lot that goes along with that. So all to say, just a lot of really interesting dynamics about Arizona, all of which, and then of course the politics here are changing and are fascinating. It's a historically red state, become somewhat more purple in recent years. We'll see how that plays out. So all that together, when I came here, I just really felt like, what a fascinating place to do conservation work. And if you can do successful conservation in this environment, there could be so much to learn that may be applicable in other places as well, because all those things together make for tremendous opportunity and really quite a few challenges.
Yeah, it definitely does. And when I was preparing for this, I saw some of the stats about the biodiversity, and I found that to be a surprise to me as well. And my family and I actually, for spring break this year, we did a little kind of like a Griswold family road trip, and we ended up at Flagstaff was kind of the destination. We did the Grand Canyon and everything. And the forest there around Flagstaff and just that whole environment was so different than anything that I'd really expected, which is kind of crazy. And so that brings me to one of the first things that I know you guys are focusing on is forest health and trying to figure out ways to make forests healthier, especially when considering the 100+ years of forest suppression that's kind of been a policy of the federal government for so long. And so could you just talk a bit about that work, maybe some of the challenges and opportunities around it, maybe some of the specifics about how do you go about making these forests more healthy?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a really exciting area of work for us. And kind of like you, so I came out here, and when I was at that point, it was with a different job for the Nature Conservancy, but I was preparing for my interview for it. And it said, two of our biggest priorities out in Arizona are forests and water. And I got to touch this. Well, I didn't know Arizona either had either of those things, right? So yes, it is a surprise to a lot of people that we have the largest contiguous strand of ponderosa pine forest in the lower 48 is largely in Arizona. So it is very significant part of the state. And you are absolutely right. Like much of the West, the issue here is decades of various policies, primarily fire suppression, have led to forests which are tremendously overgrown, overstocked. meaning that there are many, many more trees per acre than would have been there in kind of pre-European settlement situations when those forests were in a more natural state. And, it's interesting. I'm from the Northeast, and so I'm used to kind of those thick, heavy forests. And to me, that's what a forest, it's what I always thought of. But really, when you see pictures of the Arizona forest and what they should look like, they are much thinner. There will be really spaced out. Our research shows that we're anywhere from 2 to upwards of 50 times more trees per acre than would be there in just kind of a naturally occurring regime. So these forests are much, much thicker than they really should be. And then, of course, one of the things that means is lots and lots of small, thin, small diameter trees that are in. So instead of kind of large or healthy trees that are spread out, you have a lot more small trees that are really close together. And that, as you rightly said, is what really leads to these conditions that can create catastrophic fires. And once they burn, they can burn very severely. These are forests that would naturally be adapted to fire, but fire in that kind of thin, less dense forest is very healthy, whereas the kind of fire we have now in these overgrown forests is catastrophic both to people and to nature. So effectively, that's the situation that we have. So our focus has always been on we need to, as quickly as possible, restore those forests to a more natural condition. And really, mostly what that means is thinning. There's other aspects of restoration, but the big aspect is thinning, getting them back to a more natural state with far fewer trees, but the ones that are there are big and healthy and supporting the ecology and the people that live there. So the other aspect that's really important to understand is that in Arizona, it's all National Forest Service land. So like in the Southeast, Nature Conservancy and others do a lot of forest work. We have a lot of private land there. So it's going to be a different kind of approach, whereas here we're talking almost completely federal land, Forest Service land. So our theory of change has always been that we need to work with the Forest Service to effectively change the way that we all approach the forest to greatly increase the pace and scale of forest restoration, of thinning. We have to get those trees out of there, is effectively what it comes down to. And so we do that in a whole bunch of ways, but we work directly. The Nature Conservancy has a contract with the Forest Service where we are responsible for getting in there, and we do it through contractors, but clearing acres of trees. And our purpose in doing that is not so much to actually get those acres restored, although that's a big part of it, but it's really to get credibility by working on the ground and be able to test out all kinds of efficiencies and innovations. These trees that we have here are very low value, especially the thin ones that are creating that overcrowding are not high from an economic standpoint, are not high value. So it's very marginal work. So really a big part of our work is working with Forest Service and with businesses to create what are ways that we can change business practices. How can we be more efficient to get this done and, make it as profitable as possible. Our theory has been that we have over 1 million acres in Arizona. That's more than Nature Conservancy can do. That's more than government can do on their own. It's got to be private sector and private industry, and you need to have investment of private industry that's focused on an appropriate and sustainable forest products industry. So everything we do is really trying to get to that point where businesses and the Forest Service can work together to create a healthy and thriving forest products economy that will lead to appropriately managed sustainable forests. And we can certainly talk more about, some specifics of what that looks like.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear more about that. And so last year, I believe I had a great conversation on this podcast with Rob Addington, who does a lot of forest work. Yeah, I mean, he's awesome. And then after that, I heard from some folks in the funding world, foundation world, who were talking a lot about the need to figure out a way to make this forest thinning profitable. And when we're in Colorado, a lot of it's around beetle kill forests.
Yeah.
But I'm a firm believer that in order for, at least as things stand now in this country, in order for things to scale, there needs to be a profit motive.
Yeah.
At least a portion of it needs to be driven by profit. And so, like, how do you even begin to go about that, to talk with, for-profit businesses, corporations, whatever? I mean, to figure out a way to, whether it's make a market for these thin trees, or I'd just love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So certainly, absolutely. At the beginning, we've been working in the forest for a while. This kind of most recent iteration has been about a decade or so when we've had our contract. And yes, certainly a lot of, conversations. And I think a lot of private, and certainly there's a lot of not great history between forest industry and the environmental movement. And a lot of that is justified and what have you. But regardless, there's not been a lot of trust between those two sides. So we generally found that in our outreach to industry, it's been very well received because every good faith actors want to learn how to work together, certainly. Yes. And so, that's of course where we've focused. I think the other key aspect has been our contract. It's called a Master Stewardship Agreement. It's kind of a clunky name, but that's the government name for it. And this Master Stewardship Agreement, like I said, it really gave us skin in the game, that we ourselves, with our money and with our staff, have a responsibility to get acres restored. And so we see the same realities that industry sees. We see the same challenges with the Forest Service and the same opportunities that industry sees. So it really gave us a real, like I said, I think a real seat at the table and a lot of credibility in doing that work, that we aren't just some conservation group, going around and telling industry you should do this or that, or telling the Forest Service you should do this or that, but really partnering with both and really making very significant investments of our staff and our resources to be part of that. And we've become very, very effective, and we do get a lot of acres restored ourselves because of the work we do. But again, the real benefit to us having that agreement is because of the partnership opportunities it creates and the ways that we can, we'll do something on our contract area and we'll do it in partnership with the Forest Service. We'll try some kind of efficiency, and I'll give you an example here in just a second. We'll test it out together. And if it works well, the Forest Service can replicate that and roll that out, and let all private operators up there benefit from that same efficiency. And a lot of these things are not super high tech by any means, but at the same time, you couldn't do them if you didn't have the credibility from being on the ground. And again, if we just came in and said, oh, you should try this, it would never work. But if we said, well, let's try this together on our contract, and we're taking some of the risk too to see if it works, it's a real different conversation. So just to give you a quick idea here, I mean, one of the big challenges is, so when trees are cut, they get loaded onto trucks and get hauled somewhere by a contractor, and they get hauled to a mill to be processed. And typically, what happens is there needs to be a good bookkeeping system. So every single one of those trucks has to go to a special certified scale, get weighed on that scale so that everybody knows exactly how many pounds of trees there are that are coming off the forest. And there's all kinds of paperwork and that goes along with that. And as you can imagine, it's a very complex process. So we said, could we try this differently? And instead of doing every single truck, can we just do an average, right? Let's weigh, X trucks, figure out what the average is, and we'll just then figure out how many trucks are coming off, multiply that by the average, and say that's the total tonnage that came off. Really simple idea, but totally can change the economics of this, because now your haul drivers are not going 10, 20, 100 miles out of their way to the special scale. You're not dealing with this complicated system of paperwork and where the paper is being kept, about how much weight there actually is. You could greatly make it much more efficient. So that's the kind of thing that we tried. It was really successful. Now the Forest Service is rolling that out across the a lot of the areas where we work and letting other private industry benefit from that same approach. So again, I mean, there's nothing terribly complicated about that, but it requires that real on the ground credibility and relationships to say, hey, can we take this risk together? Let's see if it works. And if it doesn't, some of that will be on us too. And if it does, then this could be to everyone's benefit.
Yeah. And you just think about in anything, even just in day-to-day life, inertia is such a powerful force, and people do things a certain way because they've always done them that way. And even making slight changes can be hard. And I think, the fact that TNC has the credibility to come in and say, hey, why don't we try this out? I think that really speaks, once again, people are hearing it over and over and over on these TNC episodes, to this power of relationships, power of partnerships. There's no easy way to build those up other than just the long haul, which y'all have been doing for so long,
Yeah, that's right.
One more question about forest health. I've actually been reading a bit about a specific forest thinning project that I'm somewhat involved with some of the people that are doing it. And everything that I've ever read about forest health and about, the how do we make these Western forests more healthy, the science seems to always point to there's too much fuel, we need to thin it out. Yeah. But then I think sometimes there are folks on who are well-meaning, but maybe they're really focused on a certain endangered species or a certain animal. And so they can push back on the need to thin. And, I was just reading a blog post recently where somebody was saying you shouldn't thin because this science. And it reminds me of this, it's just a emphasis of this world we're living in where it's just hard to pin things down. I mean, from the Nature Conservancy or your perspective, TNC's perspective, which is a science-based organization, are there any downsides to thinning forest? I mean, is there any argument against it that I'm missing? Because I feel like I've talked to a lot of really smart people that are doing really good work in this space, and I don't see it, but I always like to ask people, am I missing anything?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I'd be curious what else you've heard and what different people have said on this. I think of course, it all depends what you mean by thinning, right? And there's the history of clear cutting in the West and things like that I think we can all agree are not appropriate for our forests here, and we want to stay far away from those types of practices. But I will say, we've looked at this in Arizona from a number of perspectives, certainly from a water perspective. We've also done some really innovative science from a carbon perspective to try to understand what the impacts of forest restoration are to carbon stocks. And the science pretty clearly shows us that it does have to be at scale. And so there is that, I think, right? Certainly to get the carbon benefits, you really need to do large scale forest restoration, because a lot of those benefits will come from reducing the risk of a catastrophic fire, which needs to be done at a large scale to really make it work. So, but our science really clearly shows that without urgent restoration, these forests are in trouble. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And we further see, and we're already seeing some of this, that if and when these forests burn, the climate is changing, and the soil conditions are not the same, and they very well may not grow back at all in the same condition that we have them now. So there's some real risk factors here. So from where we sit, and certainly from where I sit, I think the science is very clear that we do need to thin those forests, and we need to do it urgently. And as you said, there are some important, certainly there's going to be caveats to that, right? There's maybe some places or what have you, but we think it can be done, and we see that it can be done, that you can thin the forest and leave behind the right trees, leave behind the big old growth trees, and create a much healthier environment. And I think I would say that the risk of inaction, I mean, of course, there's some risk to getting out there and working in the forest like that, and there may be some not ideal outcomes, but overall, the risk of inaction is far, far greater because of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I went down some rabbit hole on the internet recently, reading some blogs, and I was like, maybe I'm losing my mind here, but thankfully I'm going to be talking with Dan. He can set me straight. So that's awesome. Another part of your work in Arizona that I found fascinating, that again, it's just surprising, how kind of deep I am in the West, and I really didn't know much about this region at all. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Verde, the Verde River.
We actually, in Arizona, it's actually called the Verde.
Verde.
Which is kind of funny.
I knew I was close.
It's not the proper.
It's not Verde. Yeah. It's not Verde. Like I learned.
It should be. Yeah, but
Verde.
People here call it the Verde. Yeah.
Well, talk about the Verde River or that whole watershed, because so much of the really, really cool, innovative work y'all are doing seems to be centered around that watershed. And I again, kind of like zooming in from all of Arizona, could you zoom into that watershed and talk about why that's such an attractive place for you and your team to devote your resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I think that's really enabled our success, and I give my predecessors in this job and in leadership with this organization credit for this, is that certainly, again, anywhere, but especially I think in a historically red state, to be a successful conservation organization, we knew we had to do work that mattered to people and that met people where they were. And we couldn't certainly conserving rural land is important, and that's still an important part of what we do today. But we also had to do work that was relevant to our population centers on a day-to-day basis. And so many years ago, we started working in the Verde, which is upstream from Phoenix. And it's part of a system that provides over 50% of the water supply for the city of Phoenix. It's a really important in-state river for people. And also it's one of the last free-flowing rivers in the Southwest, very important ecologically as well. So we really identified this as a really important place to work. And one of the things that was happening then, and certainly is happening more now, is there's a lot of attention, appropriately so, on the main stem of the Colorado River. And that's usually when there's an article, right, about water use in the West, it's about the Colorado. And we really kind of found a little more of a niche for ourselves. The Verde is part of the Colorado River basin, but we really felt that we could be most effective here. And I know you've talked to Taylor Hawes, and certainly we work really well. And I mean, the main stem and the whole system is critically important. And there's a need to complement that with real localized work on the in-state rivers, especially as the Colorado gets more and more stressed. These in-state rivers become even more important and even more threatened. We need to do more work on them. So Verde River, again, very important water supply for the Phoenix area. Very beautiful river. It's really accessible from where I sit in my office in Phoenix. In an hour and 20 minutes, I could be in a kayak on the river, so on the upper river. So it's not far from here. If you ever come to Arizona, we'd be happy to take you out on a float trip on the Verde. It's probably one of my favorite things to do in the.
I will show up. Don't offer that, because I will show up.
No, come. It's spectacular, and our waters here are so. There's so few of them, and they're so precious what we have. And you get on the river and you start floating down, and there's the trees all around and the animals, and it's just a totally different world that up there. So it's from kind of a emotional or spiritual perspective, it's just a really special place as well. At any rate, very important area, very accessible. We focused on a few different aspects of that work there. It's a relatively small system, so it's kind of exciting to, when you're talking about like the whole main stem Colorado, I mean, there's so many users, it can be really daunting. Compared to that, in Verde, it's possible to work with some of the biggest users of water pretty easily, just because there's not that many of them. So we have some great relationships with agriculture, with farmers who are working on the river. We have some great relationships with tribal nations, especially with the Yavapai Apache Nation, that is a very important water user along the Verde. So as you know, of course, from all your work with TNC, one of our real strengths is that we're on the ground. We live in the community. A lot of times we live in the communities that we work. So we have staff that live and work along the Verde, that are part of the communities, that know everybody. And again, that we're really there. We're at the table. It's not just, me parachuting in from Phoenix and saying what a good idea something is, but everything we do comes out of partnerships and collaborations with the local community there. So much of the work historically has been focused on agriculture there and working with agricultural water users to be more efficient while protecting or hopefully increasing their livelihoods. So we do all kinds of irrigation efficiencies there. We've done some really exciting crop switching in partnerships with farmers to switch to crops that will yield a better return for them and are also better for the river there. We've done a lot of work directly with agriculture, and you can see from our work, you can actually see the difference that we can make to water levels in the river, especially at certain times of years, because we've been able to be more efficient in a way that really, one of the things we say along the Verde is we want to keep farmers farming and keep rivers flowing. So we're not going to protect the river by, buying out all the farms or something, right? We're only going to do it by being in partnership with agriculture and being in partnership with development there too, where we can be. So we're doing a lot of work on reuse and recharge of water, capturing water that could be runoff or capturing effluent and treating it and using that as ways to boost the water supply in the river. So we have a real wide-ranging areas of really comprehensive ways that we focus on sustainability along the Verde River and on protecting that area for people and for nature.
Along the lines of the river, can you talk a bit about the aquifer there? Because when I was reading up on everything, I found that to be super interesting as well.
Yeah. So this really is interesting. We started our work primarily, or our kind of most recent phase has been kind of surface water. So working with, for example, working with agricultural water users on how much they're diverting from the river and finding ways to put in better equipment, make that more efficient, reduce their costs, keep more water in the river, win-win. And so a lot of work like that over time. However, the Verde River is fed, the upper part of the river is fed from groundwater. So water that's below the ground is what feeds the upper parts of the river and provides the critically important base flow that protects that's the bedrock of the river system. Our water team really did a lot of science and also a lot of collaboration with the local communities there and determined that it was really important to protect. So right now, this area, this aquifer, is called the Big Chino aquifer, is overlaid mostly by ranches. And so you have relatively little development, pretty large unfragmented landscape. It's also a really beautiful area. We can take you there too to see it. It's really spectacular. Yeah, come and see it. It's really spectacular and very important from a wildlife standpoint. But certainly if it's developed in an inappropriate way and all that water is pulled out to support a high level of development, the impact that will have is it will eventually cut off the water supply to the top of the Verde. And so all the things that we're doing or that anyone's doing about being more efficient or conserving water along the river won't matter if we lose that critically important base flow that starts the whole thing. So one of the really cool accomplishments that our staff here has done a wonderful job of, and it's really exciting, is we were able to access quite a bit of federal money and some other private money, and we're putting some of our funds in as well. And it will be a total of a $23 million project that will all be to do conservation easements. So basically to keep the land in private ownership, but protect it from inappropriate development in this area that will really protect the aquifer that supplies the Verde River. So I think it's just a great story of really a comprehensive approach to looking at this problem. You have the stuff you can see every day, right? The water that's coming off, the surface water. You can see some inefficiencies there and come up with more efficient systems. But our team really did a great job of going deeper than that, really, really understanding how this river works, where the threats are, and recognizing we had to protect the groundwater that forms the base flow.
I'll tell you, when I was preparing for this, I saw the announcement about the 23 million and the 11.5 RCPP grant.
Yeah.
And before I went all in on this podcast, I was conservation director at Palmer Land Conservancy, and I filled out, I think, 3 of those applications, and I didn't get any of them. And it about broke me doing those applications. So huge congrats.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
That. I mean, that is a huge, I mean, that's a lot of money, but that is such a competitive process.
Yeah.
And so kudos to you and your staff for making that happen. I mean, what a huge amount of money to put towards easements. That's amazing. It's
really great. It's really great. And I give our team just huge credit for it. And to the theme you were talking about before, I think one of the things that made it so successful is we had over 20, maybe 25 letters of support that we got from local communities, from our elected officials, from some of the tribal nations that we work with. I mean, we really went for that in a way that reflected a true and really deep partnership with the local communities.
Yeah, there's no way around it. I mean, that is a huge accomplishment, securing that funding. And then, all right, so we've been talking about agriculture, but then I saw another announcement that TNC worked in partnership with Trust for Public Land to open up a new park in the area. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. That was also a great one. Also, again, our staff up in that part of the state has been busy doing a lot of great stuff. But this Trust for Public Land is a wonderful partner to us. They do a lot of great on the ground conservation work, and they were the leads but we were certainly a very active part of this project to secure the land and get it into state ownership. That it's called Del Rio Springs. It's a really important part of Arizona's history. There's a lot of great history there. It's actually where at one point the water came out of the ground there and was put into train cars, and it provided the water for the Grand Canyon at one point. So it's kind of so there's still some really cool structures on the site and some great history there. It's also a very beautiful place. Also has impacts on aquifers that will protect the Verde River, as well as, again, a lot of the land itself is really valuable from a connectivity standpoint as wildlife moves through there. And so we worked together with Trust for Public Land and others to get this land purchased, and it's now in state ownership. It's designated to be state park. It will take a little while for all the infrastructure to be put in place that will make it open to the community, but it will be a wonderful amenity for the community and for the recreation-based economy in that area when it's open in the coming years. And one of our biggest parts of that, we contribute a lot of the science. We brought some money to the table as well. And our government relations staff were able to get $6 million of state funding allocated to that project. So as you know from all your work, of course, right, with these big land projects, it takes years to put all the pieces together, and then you need to have right landowner and the right financing and all the conditions in place so that when all those conditions are finally in place, you're ready to go. And we just were. Everything was there. And so this was able to happen. So it's a very exciting project. That partnership between TNC and TPL, you guys just have such an amazing track record. The newest state park here in Colorado was the TNC and TPL were two of the big partners in that. And it's so cool because in a lot of ways, somebody on the outside could think, well, they're competitors or whatever. But the fact that you guys are able to combine forces, combine brains, combine resources to make these big things happen, that the public, it's just such a direct benefit to the public and indirect benefit in many ways people don't even understand. But I love that collaboration across the board. Oh, thanks. Yeah. It is great. And I agree. It's, the average public, right? They don't care if it's TPL or TNC or who's who or, right, what our competition may be. It's like, if we can do work together, it's better for everybody. So I think it's been a good partnership, and that's very much our approach in Arizona as it is in Colorado and other places. Is there's more than enough conservation work for all of us to do together, and I think there's more than enough resources too. If we can work together, inspire bigger and better things, and bring more resources to the table. So that's really been a big part of our approach. We have very little kind of outright competition with really any other conservation group in the state. Much more focused on collaboration.
All right, so we've talked about ag, we talked about forest, we talked about outdoor recreation, now cities, which I think some people may be surprised, not people who listen to this podcast, but just the average person may be surprised about all the innovative work TNC is doing in cities. And like you were saying, the cities in Arizona are very extreme in a lot of ways, with the climate.
Yeah.
So can you just give kind of an overview of all the cool stuff y'all are doing in the cities?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one that started about a decade ago and kind of in a similar vein to what we're talking about with the Verde. We recognized that we really wanted to do work that was relevant to people, that met people where they were, and that brought nature to solve some of the biggest challenges that we have. So we were one of the first chapters. There were a handful. I think Colorado was up there as well. One of the first chapters across the Conservancy to develop a cities program. And it took a little while to find our footing, but we determined that the best thing to focus on would be heat for us. And that if we could bring nature-based solutions to help address the impacts of heat in the Phoenix metro area in particular, that was a really unique way that we could engage. So it's unique in that it really focuses on frontline communities. So these are the communities that are going to be kind of the first and worst affected by the impacts of climate change. In one of the things we say here is that Phoenix is hot for everybody, but the impacts of that heat really vary depending on where you live and what your life is like there. So we have one of our initial findings was that we have neighborhoods that are just a few miles apart, as little as 2 miles apart, that can have up to a 13-degree temperature difference, which, here, those 13 degrees, that can be the difference between, 102 and 115, right? Ooh. So yeah, we're talking really high numbers here. So they can be really different. And those temperatures are highly, highly correlated with tree canopy. And they're also very highly correlated with social vulnerability or childhood poverty. And so the neighborhoods that have the fewest trees have high temperatures and high childhood poverty. So we really wanted to focus on those areas. So our work has very much been in partnership with the city of Phoenix and now with many of the other municipalities, and really in support. A few of the cities, Phoenix is one, has a citywide tree canopy cover goal, and our work is in support of helping them meet that goal. But again, with a real focus on the frontline communities, those that are the first and worst impacted by climate change. So it's a really exciting area of work. It's really, like you said, sometimes people may think, well, is this mission creep or why are you doing this? But it is, again, this is, if we're really serious about nature benefiting people and using nature to adapt, this is the kind of work we have to be doing. Even we've obviously talked a lot about partnerships, and I know that's a big focus of all the TNC podcasts that you do. But I would say this work, more than anything else, is truly, truly partnership focused. It's really all about it's not us going in and saying we're going to plant trees here. It's really working in partnership with neighborhood groups, with community organizations. We have a wonderful partner, the Phoenix Revitalization Corporation, which is a very active community group that we work with. And our work is really all about enabling others and building the capacity of others to bring nature-based solutions to their neighborhood.
And for people who want to go have a deep dive on that, I did a podcast last year with Chris Hawkins, who does a lot of TNC's city work in Denver. And so we talked, it's obviously different than Phoenix, but it was very interesting just, when you hear about the socioeconomic differences of neighborhoods with trees and neighborhoods that don't have trees. And then when you start thinking about it, I think about it here in Colorado Springs, and it's very evident. But it's one of those things that's kind of hidden in plain sight. You don't really know until somebody smart like you tells me.
Well, yeah, it is really, that's right. It is hidden in plain sight, but you don't really think about what the impacts of it are until you really see it. And again, until you really talk with the communities. And so much of our initial work there was really about building relationships, listening to community members, understanding what their pain points were, and how could we support them in addressing it, and and understanding, like for example, people knew about pathways that kids, like things that you could never know from outside, but pathways that how kids walked to school where there was no tree canopy, right? And that for example, something like that could be a real focus area. One of the stories that one of a government partner tells was that community was talking about a need for trees around a bus stop in a certain location. And he was very confused because he knew for a fact there was no bus stop there. But it turned out the community members were actually talking about a school bus stop that was, really important. And so, yeah, I think more than anything else that we've done, that work has really been informed by and focused on reflecting the values and the desires and the hopes of the people that it's designed to benefit. And really, our work is never about us being the lead in it. It's really about supporting local communities to have the nature-based solutions that they desire.
Yeah. Like I say this all the time, but it's so clear about, the true focus on, I feel like it's almost like service, you're just trying to make those around, you're trying to give the resources and the energy or whatever to make the people around you better. And it's just such a great approach you guys have. If you don't mind, I'd love to hear more about your personal journey in conservation, personal and professional journey, because as I was researching about all the different things TNC Arizona is working on, then I found some articles about you. I was like, oh man, this guy's really interesting. And he does a lot of really cool stuff. Some people might think is weird stuff, but I think is really cool. Like how many races have you run?
Total, I don't know, a lot.
But like marathons, half marathons?
Yeah. So 4 full marathons over probably 30, 40 half marathons and trail races and things like that. So yeah, it's been a big part of my life for a while. It's always something I've really enjoyed.
So, all right, I do a lot of running. I guarantee I'm not fast as you, but I love to run. But there's a lot of people when I start explaining stuff, like if you tell somebody I've run 4 marathons, there's a large percentage of people that will look at that and they'll just kind of be like, why would you do that? Why would you do that? And so I understand the fun of it. I understand the athletic part of it, but for me at least, I try to do hard things athletically because I feel like it makes me better in the parts of my life that actually, matter. It's not just this, it's important in the moment to run these races, but the hope is that lessons learned from that I can apply to work or family or friends or these other things. So like, what do you get out of pushing yourself that hard? What's the attraction, and then what are the benefits?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and I don't know if we'll have time now, but
we could do a whole podcast.
It'd be good, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because I was looking about some of your athletic achievements, and you can go a lot further than I can for sure. So I'd be interested in talking more about that. But yeah, I think it is certainly, kind of the obvious answer, but but certainly a true one is the perseverance aspect, right? When you think about these goals and you set out to do them, they seem very daunting, and then you realize you can do them. And then, especially at different times in my life when I've been able to really see improvement and, get times that I didn't think were possible or even that would have been difficult, maybe 6-12 months before. And then all of a sudden you can do something that you couldn't do then. It is a great boost for me, it's a boost to my self-esteem, and it's it's exciting to see that. Absolutely. I don't do as much trail running as I would like. I do more road or even at the gym now just because of schedule, but I love trail running. It's probably my most favorite thing. And certainly it's a wonderful way to see places. And even with my road races too, I will say I've seen so many things that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, or just been to places or seen things at certain times of day, that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I remember back when I lived in New York City, sometimes like running at night and you just get a whole different view of the river or the park or something like that. Right. And so, it's connected me to place in a whole different way. And then I guess I'll say too, I do think not everybody's wired to be a runner, and, that's fine. People do all kinds of different things or don't do them. But for me, I found it really with a pretty demanding job, it's really a way that I feel some balance and some control in my life at times is to have that. And when I don't do those things is when I do notice like my mood starting, I get more moody, I could get more anxious as to when I'm really prioritizing that. Like I know I show up better for other parts of my life when I'm prioritizing that aspect.
Yeah, same, exact same. Although I'm not smart enough to realize that my mood's slipping when I quit running, and then my wife's like, "You need to go running." I found an article that I think it was fairly recent, and I think it was called Front Doors magazine.
Oh yeah,
I think.
yeah.
And it was a profile of one of your days, and you fill up your day. You seem to be very efficient with your time, and you devote a lot of time. But we've got kids the same age. Yeah. We both like doing similar athletic things. I'd love to hear what is kind of how do you? I guess a simple question is, how do you fit the running in? When is that a first thing in the morning thing for you, or do you fit it in depending on schedule? Like, how do you manage to fit that in when you've got all these other important things, including being a dad?
Yeah, and then I want to hear your answer to that one too. But it really is a fit in kind of thing, and I'm pretty flexible about it. I mean, ideally, I would like to go in the mornings, and that's kind of when there's the opportunity. And I would say majority of the time I do. And it's like that classic thing, right? That if you don't do it in the morning, it just gets harder and harder. You think you're going to have time later, and then you don't, and then something else happens, and then all of a sudden you realize you didn't get it in that day. So ideally I like the mornings, but I am really flexible. I don't mind running at 7:30 at night, which a lot of people just won't do. But for me, that's okay. If I know I'm going to be doing that. So I've been fairly happy with the consistency that I've been able to bring the last few years. But I would say a part of the reason for that is the flexibility, is that I don't need to do it at the same time every day. And I'm, again, willing to, like, a lot of people really hate to exercise at night, but, I'll do that if I can. So, but yeah, I would say it's just a fit in kind of thing.
How many days a week do you run or do exercise? It doesn't have to be run.
I shoot for 6.
That's what I try to do as well. I have to do it. I mean, I've always tried to think, well, maybe come up with some excuse as to why I don't, I need to recover. I went hard and I just need to do it every day. And the older I get, I think we're probably about the same age. Yeah. I'm 46. And I think even if it's very, very easy, I mean, even like a walk is better than doing nothing.
For sure.
I just have to. All right. So how did you end up devoting all of this energy you have and all the brains you have to conservation work? Because it seems like from the very beginning, at least, coming out of college, you've been focused on different things related to land, water, the environment. What have you always thought you would go into that line of work, even as a kid? How did it kind of become your focus?
Yeah, a little bit circuitously. It's funny. I was actually listening to some of your other interviews, and I was listening to the one with Paige. Paige from Colorado, and it was great to hear about and her background. I was reflecting on a lot of ways that mine was different, because I think it was not obvious for me what I didn't grow up in the West. I grew up in the Northeast. Grew up in a very suburban kind of situation. So I always liked the outdoors, but that was kind of it. And then in high school, a friend and I I grew up outside of Boston, and we started taking road trips once we were able to drive. We would take one of our parents' cars and drive up to northern New England, and that's like a totally different ball game up there. I mean, it's really wild. It's really rugged. I remember how excited we would be when we kind of got beyond, like, you couldn't see any power lines or something like that. And it just felt really different. And so that was my first taste of, I guess, kind of falling in love with the outdoors, going to some of these places and then hiking and camping in northern New England. It was really, really special for me. And then I kind of had a few formative experiences in this regard. I had the chance to live in Alaska for several years in the early 2000s. I
saw that on your LinkedIn. I was curious about that.
Yeah. And that was really just because I had always wanted to, after college, kind of classic thing, wasn't sure what to do with myself. I had a philosophy degree, which was a great degree, but obviously didn't set me up for any particular career path. Yeah. And so I figured if it was ever the time in my life to explore Alaska, that, I was single, I was, I didn't have any major obligations. So, I went up to Alaska and I lived there for a few years. I worked not in the environmental field, but in the nonprofit field. I worked for a food bank when I lived there. And I loved it. And if you like the outdoors, Alaska's the place for you. It's as good as it gets. It's so spectacular.
The scale of everything there is hard to get your head around.
It really is. It really is. It really is. And the West is spectacular, but Alaska just takes it to another level. This scale is so massive. But one of the things I noticed there was that the conversation around like natural resource issues was extremely polarized. Right. And that at that time, there was a lot of discussion about ANWR, about the wildlife refuge, and about drilling and all these things. And it was so polarized and very much like an us versus them thing, where a lot of the arguments that I was sympathetic to and that kind of the historic environmental groups were making felt really far away from day-to-day life up there. And they felt like they didn't reflect an understanding, at least to me, like it didn't reflect an understanding of people's lives and livelihoods. And so, I felt like there had to be a more collaborative way to approach this work. And because of that, it just became very acrimonious, right? It was a lot of fighting. And so then I left Alaska. I went to graduate school, and I decided I wanted, partly based on my experiences in Alaska, that I want to focus on environmental policy. So I went to graduate school for that. After graduate school, and that was in New York City, I had the chance I was based in New York, but I was working for Columbia University, and we were starting a water program that was doing global work mainly. And so I had the chance to travel quite a bit for that work. India was the main place, but we worked in other places as well, in some places in South America and in Africa. It was really amazing to, all of graduate school, to have that opportunity to travel like that. But one of the things that showed me too is it really made me, I think growing up, for me, nature was like a real distinct thing. It was, I live here, but I'm going to go somewhere where there's nature now, right? Or I'm going to go to nature and kind of appreciate it. And then I'm going to go back home. And then seeing the way people in some of the countries we worked related to nature and what their experiences were, and how it was just it was part of their livelihoods. It was part of their lives. It was spiritually a part of their lives. It was economically different, how they thought about resource use and sustainable use and extraction and all those things really gave me a different approach. And so then over time, I was doing environmental work at the time. And then I think for me, being in this field and knowing kind of what my values were, looking for a more pragmatic, collaborative type approach, that Nature Conservancy is the big dog in that kind of conservation work. And I'd always hoped to land at TNC one day. And so once I got into the field, I would say there was a little more of a path for me to eventually find my way to TNC, but I didn't set out to do conservation work at a young age. And I don't think I really knew what it was, probably till college at least.
Thinking about your time spent in India and traveling, are there any other lessons that came from that? Because the reason I ask is because I lived in Costa Rica for a year after grad school, and I just never really traveled internationally, hardly at all. And it was just such a I was 31, and it was probably one of the most formative experiences of my life, just being able to see the U.S. from the outside in. And it's not like Costa Rica is, off on the other side of the planet or anything. It was not that different, but it just changed so much about the way I think about things in a good way. And I'm curious if there's any of your leadership style or any just your worldview, if you can point to any specifics that came from that time working abroad.
Yeah, I think it's true. It is. I'm so grateful for those experiences, and certainly made me more grateful for the material comforts that I have and that many people in the States, or at least many people I knew, had and have. So certainly that aspect. Yeah, and I do think in ways that are maybe a little hard to define. It profoundly impacted my approach to leadership in the sense of just having all those experiences and perspectives, and realizing how many of your assumptions may be incorrect, it did in ways that are maybe a little hard to define, but it was certainly very, very profound, I think, having a lot of those experiences, and where there are those really huge cultural differences, then it also, I guess, makes other things seem smaller, right? Here we're very, caught up between, right, red versus blue or even urban versus rural, but right, compare like, New York City to rural India. And that's, if you can bridge that gap, then a lot of other ones seem maybe a little smaller.
Yeah, I really do think it just widens your perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I never thought of myself as being closed-minded or anything, but it's just until you experience certain things, you haven't experienced them. And so when you go to my wife has traveled a ton for her work and spent a good bit of time in India. And she said the same thing you said, that it's just, it just really opens your eyes to a lot of, it's almost like a foundational shift in the way you think about things that you can't even really describe because it's so deep down in there.
Yeah.
At least it has been for me. So I also read in that article, I promise I'm not your stalker, but I was reading all about you, and I read that you love to read, and I love to read.
Yeah.
What kind of books do you like to read? And then if you have any, I'm always looking for recommendations, and I always say, like, if they're about conservation or the West or whatever, that's great, but it could be just some crazy book you read at some point that meant a lot to you. But I'd love to hear any of the types of books you enjoy and any specific titles you could recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I had fun looking at your reading list too. It was really,
it's so great. Weird. Yeah. It's such a weird selection of books.
Yeah. You got quite a diversity there. But
somebody wrote, I do this email list where I send out recommendations, and I sent one out the other week, and somebody responded and said, "I thought you would recommend more books about mountains and prairies. Do you do that?" Not really.
Well, so I typically, or I'll often alternate fiction and nonfiction. And I would say probably one of my which I don't know if it was on your list, but one of my all-time favorite books is Endurance, the Alfred Lansing book about the Shackleton expedition. Yeah, it's such a great book. And I don't know how old that book is now, 50, 60 years, I think. And it's not dated at all. It's great. I went through a period during COVID, especially that first year, where I was reading a lot of books about Arctic exploration. And it was such great escape from being, it was Phoenix in the summer. We were stuck at home and, it was awful and so claustrophobic. And then reading these incredible trips about Arctic exploration. There's certainly or Antarctic in that case, but obviously the adventure aspect there, but really the leadership. There's a lot of leadership lessons in that book, and I've read a few biographies of Shackleton and polar explorers, and it is really interesting to think about leadership in that context. So any of those books, but yeah, Endurance is well worth it, and it's a quick read, and it's one of my all-time favorites. A couple other ones. One of my favorite leadership books is American Icon by Alan Mulally, and it's about his time at Ford and about running this massive organization in this really people-centered way. And, as a leader, he had to do a lot of really difficult things. And he did them in a way that he was just beloved by staff, by his team, by investors. And he just brought this real humble, people-oriented approach to it that I find very inspiring. So that's a great one. I just finished Radical Candor. I try to read a leadership book, at least one or two a year. So just read that one. That was pretty interesting. I will say one of my favorites, which may or may not resonate with some folks, is maybe about 2 years into this job, I read a book about imposter syndrome. It's a book. It's called The Imposter Cure. It's by Jessamy Hibbard, I think is her last name. And it was, I realized I hadn't thought of myself exactly as someone who struggled with imposter syndrome, although in some ways I recognize that. Reading that book really was kind of life-changing for me, actually, because I saw that a lot of my thought patterns were not that uncommon, even among people in leadership positions, that a lot of people have those challenges and those kind of anxieties and those thought patterns, and gave me some good tips about how to manage them. So for those who that resonates with, that was probably one of the best, most helpful books that I read in my time in this role. And then on the fiction side, actually, my favorite Western writer is Larry McMurtry. Starting in high school, I read all his books, and then I decided I'm going to read Lonesome Dove every 10 years. I'm going to read it again and just see how my relationship to that book changes and see how that book ages and what it's like to read it. But it's pretty fascinating. It's one view, obviously, of the West, but it's I do love I love his books too.
Yeah, he's amazing. Lonesome Dove. I actually read that, talking about being in Costa Rica. I read it when I was in Costa Rica, I remember. And I'd heard about it for years.
Yeah.
And I don't read all that much fiction, but that's truly one of the best books I've ever read. And it's so great. But I had not heard of The American Icon or the Imposter Syndrome, and I definitely need to read that. So those are all really, really great. Thank you. I'll have links for people listening and click through. All right, last question for you is, you just had this really cool career. You've had a lot of different experiences, both professionally and personally. You push yourself so hard athletically. And so, any kind of parting words of wisdom for the folks listening? And I think, conservation is obviously a big part of what we talk about here on the podcast, but we also talk about art. We talk about history, kind of just interesting people doing interesting things. And so anything you want to wrap this up with?
Oh, wow. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to really give words of wisdom, but I guess, something I have been thinking about a little bit lately is we all, or many people right now are very, I guess, unhappy about the divisiveness in our society, right? And there's a lot of conversation about that. But I had the chance, actually, I was at an event and I heard Van Jones speak, and he was absolutely fantastic. I mean, really blew my mind, actually. And he talked a little bit about this too. But, the way I would paraphrase it, or at least one of the things that resonated for me is like, even when we talk about the divisiveness, like a lot of people blame other people for that, right? And so sometimes within the environmental field, it's like, well, there's all this divisiveness, but it's not our fault, right? We're just doing great work, and it's not our fault if other people don't like us or what have you. And I think if we're serious about really building bridges, it starts with us, right? And starts with each of us. And it really is, I do think sometimes in the conservation field and in the environmental field, there can be some closed-mindedness to different ideas or to talking to people who maybe don't have the same beliefs that we do. And I think we're only going to get past that if we all come to the table together and recognize that, you can bemoan the divisiveness, but you can't just blame other people for that, right? You also have to look at ourselves and how we relate to each other and how open we all really are about that. So I'm not sure if that's very articulate, but it is something I've been thinking about is, if we're going to move to a true state of more collaboration, we all have to understand what our role is in creating the current condition and what we can do to change that. You can't just blame other people for it.
Yeah, very articulate and very true. I completely agree with you. Dan, this was so fun, man. It really flew by. I wasn't really paying attention to the time. But thank you so much. I know you got so much going on, and it means a lot that you would spend time answering all my crazy questions. But I really do hope I can make it down there at some point to see everything you're doing.
Yeah, please do. We'd love to have you down here. Yeah. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. Thank you for all the wonderful work that you do. It was a privilege and it was an honor for me. This was a lot of fun. So thank you. And I hope we'll have the chance to stay connected.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.